Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to this very exciting event, the virtual book launch of Karyn Maughan's new book with Kirsten Pearson called Nuclear: Inside South Africa's Secret Deal. My name is Qaanitah Hunter. I'm the Assistant Editor for Politics and Opinions at News24. And joining me is none other than the author herself, Karyn Maughan. Thank you.
Thank you so much. I'm really excited to talk about this.
Karyn Maughan is an award-winning journalist. As many of you might know, she's a documentary producer and a best-selling author. She writes for News24 and regularly appears on local and international radio and TV stations. She has been named as one of South Africa's most influential journalists. She wrote this book with Kirsten Pearson, who is a development practitioner, activist, and author who has previously worked at National Treasury and Corruption Watch. Now, Karyn, I was one of the few privileged people who were fortunate enough to get an early copy of this book, Nuclear, and to share my thoughts on it. This was my initial thoughts. After I read the book, I wrote this down. I said, it's a breathtakingly detailed probe into a dark cloud that loomed over South Africa's democracy. Now, let's get into it, Karyn Maughan. Firstly, congratulations on a book well done. Not only is it incredibly well written, it's also very, very well researched. I loved that it's very accessible and easy to read. So well done.
Thank you so much. And I just want to acknowledge Kirsten Pearson, who is my co-author, because I think having her as someone who understands procurement, understands how and why, the procurement legislation exists to protect ordinary South Africans from abuses of state tender processes, was really pivotal to this book. While I'm a massive extrovert, she's very introverted, so she's been very hesitant about doing interviews. But I really think that her efforts in this need to be acknowledged, because I think a real reason why the book is as detailed and painstakingly constructed as it is because of the kind of research that she provided.
Well done to both of you. I think that this book is released at a time where South Africa and the ANC-led government appears unwavering in their support for Russian President Vladimir Putin amid the invasion of Ukraine. And as I talk to you today, I can't stop thinking about how this book could not have come at a better time in bringing us closer to understand, the ANC government's, or the hold Putin has on the ANC government and its former president, Jacob Zuma. Let's start, Karyn. This book uses insider accounts, audio recordings, confidential minutes of ESCOM board meetings as you piece together this very secretive deal that the Zuma administration had with Russia. Let's start at the onset. Why was this deal so clandestine? What was it about it that made it so mired in a dark cloud?
I think that's a very important question, because it was actually the secrecy around it that I think was actually a large part of the deal's undoing. Because, in any procurement process, a large procurement process, there needs to be transparency, there needs to be accountability. And that simply did not happen here. And we document how Treasury is just constantly kept out of the loop on this, what would have amounted to the biggest procurement that South Africa had ever undertaken. I think at one point, Pravin Gordhan said to Zuma in 2013 that if it wasn't done properly, it would make the arms deal, quote unquote, look like a Sunday picnic. So it really was this massive financial commitment for South Africa, even in circumstances, as appears to be the case, Russia would be effectively financing it. It had massive implications for the economy, the debt to GDP ratio. And so the attempts by the administration and the Zuma administration and those, that inner circle that he had to keep everything under wraps actually proved to be one of the reasons that I think the deal fell apart. But it needs to be stressed that nuclear was never just a Jacob Zuma project. It was always in the horizon for the ANC's energy plans, national development plan, etc., etc., etc. But the constant emphasis, Qaanitah, was on the fact that, look, this needs to be affordable. It can't be a situation which causes damage to the South African economy long term. And that was really at the heart of Treasury's concerns, was there was just simply no proper funding model for it. And they were constantly being put under pressure to approve something that they really knew very, very little about. And as becomes obvious in the evidence that's given, the state capture inquiry, the testimonies, that was at the heart of their anxiety. That was at the heart, particularly of Nene's anxiety and reluctance to sign off on a letter that it emerges came from Jacob Zuma that he regarded as a potential guarantee for the deal if South Africa was unable to pay back Russia for the build.
Yeah, and you assert in the book that South Africa's allegiance to Russia was built on this illegality, the secrecy, and this misrepresentation, right? And that's the key characteristics of this deal, was that it was in most parts illegal, it was completely secret, and there was a public misrepresentation about what it actually was. But then you have to ask the question, why? Why was Zuma and his administration so blindly, was willing to risk it all for this Russian-backed deal? And you note that it was also premised on Zuma's belief that President Vladimir Putin of Russia rescued him from poisoning by American spies. You talk about the 2014 alleged poisoning of Zuma. It actually reads like a thriller. And it's really unthinkable, Karyn, how Zuma's paranoia actually led us down this really dark road.
Well, what's fascinating, and I hope that this book kind of invites an interrogation of South Africa's geopolitical philosophy. Like, what is it that we as a nation see as our national identity, our geopolitical identity on the globe? Like, are we going to call out, manifest unlawful and irregular conduct in certain countries where there are human rights abuses, but we remain silent in others because of allegiances that we have? But I think that, first and foremost, we have to acknowledge that the ANC has a very close relationship with Russia as a consequence of the support that the USSR at the time gave South Africa during apartheid, when the West was simply not prepared to speak out or take a stand on the human rights abuses that were occurring in South Africa as a consequence of apartheid. The West turned a blind eye for a very long period. It was only really in 1976 where that picture of a bloodied Hector Peterson appears on global newspapers that, activists around the world start demanding that the Western government start speaking out. America itself had a very racist Jim Crow policies. So they were unwilling, they weren't ready or willing to call out the racism and abuses of the apartheid state. Russia, the USSR, which included Ukraine, of course, was supporting the ANC. They provided them with military support. They provided them with intelligence support, which is a very important part of the story. They provided people with hospital care. They provided them. There are many comrades within the ANC who can speak Russian, whose children speak Russian. And that connection, like built in the trauma of what happened during apartheid, cannot be gainsaid. But what happens in the sort of early parts of the Zuma administration, and particularly in 2014 with the poisoning incident, is that loyalty and that kind of suspicion of a Western world that wasn't prepared to speak out about apartheid turns into something quite toxic, because
and
Zuma believes, as becomes apparent in the book with the documents, the law enforcement affidavits, everything that we were able to access, he believes that it was America that was trying to murder him, and it was Vladimir Putin who saved his life. And I honestly believe that set the stage for what followed in the years, where when Treasury people spoke out, Energy Department officials, scientists, and said, look, we have very real concerns about this potential nuclear procurement. they weren't seen in a legitimate way. They weren't seen as people who were just raising concerns because of their attempt to protect South Africa from a potentially economically crippling deal. They were seen as agents of the West. They were seen as being controlled by apartheid spies. And you can see that, Qaanitah, in the subsequent counterintelligence attacks on Treasury, the way in which people who spoke out were either removed, demonized, or accused of blatantly untrue and unsubstantiated things, that kind of allegiance to Russia becomes something that's very, very dangerous to our constitutional democracy.
Karyn, I want to get back, get into the topic around Treasury a little bit later, but let's zoom into this alleged poisoning plot that kind of what you argue set the tone for this sort of blind allegiance and to Russia in relation to the nuclear deal. In your earlier chapters, you talk about Mountuli, the former wife of former President Jacob Zuma, and how she was accused of poisoning her husband. And when it played out in the media at the time, it was almost far removed from what was happening on the other spectrum around South Africa pushing for this nuclear build program, etc. But you and your co-author have managed to piece together the events of this time in a way that brings together all the moving parts. You talk about the abuse of the state security agency. You talk about just the blatant abuse of state resources for Zuma's personal and political ends. And there's also this politicization of government process as a result. Why was the Zuma poisoning story, if you like, central to this bigger picture around telling the broader nuclear story? What was it that made you talk about it in the early chapters of the book?
Well, the Zuma signs off on the intergovernmental agreement with Rosatom 17 days after he goes to Russia in apparent desperation because he's so severely ill, and then receives what he later describes as this life-changing and life-saving treatment from Russian doctors. And the narrative that was put out by David Mhlongo, the former Minister of State Security, some of the law enforcement officials I spoke to, was very much that South African doctors couldn't identify this poison, that Jacob Zuma's life was on the line, and that it was Russian doctors who were able to ascertain what he had been given, is alleged to have been given, and how to treat it. And when he speaks about it in 2020, he says that, it was 3 different types of poison and anyone else would have died, but somehow miraculously, he was brought back from the brink. And then he talks about, you can piece together these various occasions where he talks about how in desperation he had turned to my friend, the president of Russia. So, I think that the kind of deep sense of having been saved by a Western orchestrated murder plot, and the kind of commitment that he feels to Putin was very much at the heart of this kind of, increasingly desperate desire to formalize a geopolitical alliance with Russia through the nuclear deal. Because beyond the financial implications, and I have real questions, Qaanitah, as to whether or not Russia could have even afforded to build a fleet of nuclear reactors at a cost of 1 trillion rand, which they would have had to finance if they could have actually pulled that off. But it wasn't about the finances for them. I think there was research that basically described doing a nuclear build in South Africa as a loss leader for Russia. It would have been the biggest such build that they'd financed in the world. And there are valid concerns about whether they would have actually done it or not. But it was a geopolitical statement. It was essentially South Africa saying, on a committed level, we are going to rely on Russia to provide us with 23% of our energy mix ultimately. And, in terms of, and then in a circumstance where Russia would then have been funding that, and South Africa would have had to repay Russia, the impact of that on us geopolitically, not just in terms, of our BRICS alliance with Russia, with China, with India, with Brazil, but just going forward to be dependent on Russia for a quarter of our energy supply would have had substantial, not just economic, but geopolitical consequences as well. And I think that, those within the ANC who are very firmly committed to a kind of Russian ideology of politics, to a kind of, and we see it in the language of, that is now being used to attack the courts at the moment, that sense of a state that is able to, push forward policy without any form of accountability from, be it the courts or whatever. That was really a commitment to that. And you can see it in the way that this deal is, the attempt to do the deal is done, because there is a complete refusal to be accountable to Treasury, to take the advice of experts, and ultimately a very ill-fated sense from the Zuma administration at the time that the court action being brought against the deal wasn't going to seriously jeopardize it. And I think that was a stance that they took that was fatal to the agreement actually reaching fruition in terms of a nuclear build.
Karyn, I want to take a step back and just quote from the book a little bit in relation to the Ntuli story. And you say, Ntuli Zuma's story paints an alarming picture of how intelligence and law enforcement institutions clearly abuse their powers in an apparent desperate bid to bolster an attempted murder investigation unsupported by any legally admissible evidence. Instead, they entertained strange international conspiracy theories that would only serve to reinforce Zuma's paranoia about and suspicion of the West. There are three things to take from this strange and sad story. One, Zuma had believed for decades that shadowy Western forces are determined to kill him. Two, the man who led South Africa for almost a decade was and remains convinced that Russia was one of the only few states he could ever fully trust. Three, Zuma's conspiracy theories cannot and should not simply be dismissed as the rantings of an ousted leader who has used his paranoia as ammunition against his enemies. These dark suspicions have played a pivotal role in shaping South African government's geopolitical decision-making. I think this paragraph really sums it up for me and takes us into the heart of what was happening and how this former president operated during this time. Now, Karyn, the nuclear deal seemed to have been the flag on top of the state capture mountain, if you like, the prize, the ultimate prize for the Guptas and for Zuma. We saw it through the acquisition of Shiva uranium, sort of this preparation for this big deal that was to come. But you also saw it in the bizarre occurrences that happened at the time. We saw it in the firing of Nhlanhla Nene as Minister of Finance in 2015. There's no way, right, we can separate his axing and what was happening at Treasury and other departments at the time to this nuclear deal.
No, not at all. And I mean, that's where I think the state capture inquiry has been so valuable, Qaanitah, because, we write about this in the book, but these cabinet memos emerge at the time of Nene's firing, where the nuclear committee that's headed by Zuma gives this presentation about, prior to the commitment by cabinet to now put out a request for proposals on the nuclear deal, which was a major step forward in this whole process. That there would be a 3.2 trillion rand profit on a nuclear new build, and the basis of them making these submissions to cabinet is an article that's written by an academic who now says, it was printed in the Mail and Guardian, and who we spoke to and said, basically they radically misrepresented what he said. I mean, these seismic decisions are taken, and Nene is just, such a fascinating figure for me, because he's this introverted, quiet person who was constantly, asked to sign a letter that would amount to guarantee, says no, then is cast as, part of a nefarious Treasury, apartheid spy infiltration, and is just constantly trying to push back. And it's really, it's the timing of it, this presentation of this nuclear plan to cabinet as a basis for which to now try and seek the procurement of, key pivotal step in this process, the timing is absolutely about nuclear. And that can never be second guessed. But I think, what's interesting as well is that, Nene speaks about, for example, a month or so before Project Spiderweb emerges, where, it's this whole claim about Maria Ramos as the queen of leaves, and she's controlling everyone. The very same.
That was a fake intelligence report, Karyn.
Yes, exactly. That Zuma says to Nene, I know Treasury is infiltrated by apartheid spies. And then, of course, the fascinating, this is all tolerated by cabinet, by government, in 2015. Des van Rooyen is just replaced 4 days later, and they carry on and they carry on. But it's at the point at which Pravin Gordhan is fired on the basis of Operation Checkmate, another fake intelligence report, that, we see, pushback starting to happen from the leadership of the ANC, and then, of course, ultimately Zuma being removed in 2018. But what's so fascinating is the language of that fake intelligence report is, Gordhan and Mcebisi Jonas are going to US and London to collaborate with Western forces and to commit economic treason against South Africa. And that was the exact language. I mean, that was at the heart of Zuma's belief. Like, these Western forces are trying to kill him. And now Gordhan and Jonas, who are the biggest stumbling blocks in this geopolitical vision that he has of a nuclear deal with Russia, now they're aligning with these Western forces. And it's at that point, that decision then to fire Gordhan, I think, is where the ANC, that had been tolerating what had been happening or supporting it to some degree, had to sort of say, well, this is where the rubber hits the road. Can we actually continue with this? Given that, this man is so convinced by a 3-page report that appears to have been written on a WhatsApp. At what point do we actually say, no, this, I would argue this madness has gone on long enough.
But I mean, the ANC was along for the ride up until that point. And very supportive. I mean, I remember there were Lekgotlas of the ANC that took place where there was this direct assertion that nuclear was going to save the day. And there was, every time there would be this load shedding, or when there was concerns around the purge that happened, was it in 2015, Karyn, at Eskom?
Yeah.
There was this there was this justification that South Africa needed to be on this path. And I remember there was this insistence, when there was concerns by the French, Arriva, and other companies, I think the Americans as well, around, how did Rosatom get this contract, if you like, and there was this consistent type of assertion that this is the reconfiguration, or this is BRICS, the reconfiguration of South Africa's policy to be completely aligned with BRICS and South to South cooperation. That was the kind of language that existed at the time, but all in a manner to mask the underhandedness of the deal and the possible corruption that had ensued at the time.
Well, I think I'm glad you mentioned the March 2015 purge of Eskom officials, because the only person who survives that purge, of course, is Matshela Koko. And, we get Eskom minutes and recordings that very clearly demonstrate that he, Anaj Singh, Brian Molefe, were at the forefront of trying, after the energy department didn't make good on the prospect of actually doing the deal, making the deal happen, that Eskom, which is the site of capture as well, becomes the primary agent by which the nuclear deal is going to be pushed through. And I mean, Suzanne Daniels, who's a whistleblower, she, of course, was one of the people who gave evidence at the Eskom inquiry and was herself fired because of communication with Salim Essa. She speaks about Matshela Koko saying to her point blank that we need to push this deal through, that there needs to be a formalized agreement before, I think it was July or June 2017. and it needed to be done before the ANC elective conference, because there was this anxiety that once, I think they all believed that Nkosazana Dlamini Zuma would be elected as president, but there was also this anxiety that they couldn't necessarily guarantee that she would go along with it. So they were just absolutely hell-bent on making it happen, regardless. And I mean, the recordings are so instructive, because there's these bold assertions about Treasury processes being complied with, 56-page Treasury, it's just, oh, no, we've done that, it's fine, which was, of course, not true. So it was the sense in which they were absolutely, undeterred by any sort of sense of commitment to a proper processing, to a constitutionally required procurement process that was intended to protect, everyone within this country from improper expenditure. And, I think there's obviously the political dimension to this, aligning, becoming essentially like a little mini Russian nuclear colony, and then becoming a vehicle, as Rosatom itself stated, by which Russia could then go out into Africa and do nuclear deals, do nuclear builds in other African countries in a way that would, firmly align them to a Russian BRICS agenda. But then there's also the fact that, as we've seen in the state capture inquiry, the Guptas had Shiva uranium. They bought it in 2010 with the clear...
Almost in anticipation for this deal.
Yes, absolutely. And, as Daniels points out, it wouldn't have been about them, making money off uranium. It would have been all the kickbacks associated with the contracts to do consultancy work, to transport uranium, because that was the MO, right? Was like, we'll give you access to these deals, and then kickbacks. We saw that at Transnet, we saw that to some degree at Eskom. So the capture project and the BRICS kind of geopolitical project align very firmly sort of towards the end of 2016 and early 2017, where the captured and the become the sort of last bastion fighting for this thing to go through.
And Karyn, I mean, fast forward then to 2018, former President Jacob Zuma is removed from office after, Nkosazana Dlamini Zuma loses at the Nasrec conference. And then Cyril Ramaphosa is elected president. Then Russian President Vladimir Putin comes to South Africa for a BRICS meeting, and then very firmly asks Ramaphosa, what's up with my nuclear deal?
Yeah. And I mean, that's what's so fascinating, because there's been a lot of speculation as to if there was some kind of incentive beyond the political for there to be this push by the ANC government for a nuclear deal with Russia. Betrayal of the Promise report, I think in 2017, suggested that the ANC may have received something like 100 million rand to fund its election campaign, I think in around 2014 or so. I asked Jacob Zuma about that, and he described it as propaganda. He was adamant that there was no corruption involved in this, that this was the best solution to South Africa's energy crisis, that people were worried about the expense, but in actual fact, it would be the thing that saved the South African economy, for example. But, there are very real questions, certainly in terms of why the Kremlin is so confident. And it comes through in the book. I mean, we spoke to Tina Jumat-Peterson, we spoke to Minister Kubai. There are these little telling points where, as Minister Kubai said, it very much appeared that they didn't understand when the thing was overturned in the court what the implications of that were. They didn't understand that the IGA, the Intergovernmental, was now off the table. And she speaks about this very bizarre interaction that she has and her impressions of it. But there's this. There are valid questions to be asked about, why it was that South Africa was so hell bent on doing something that it clearly didn't have the money for, and the question marks over what that would have meant economically for the country. And Ramaphosa himself has not closed the door at all. And the language of the ANC, and you know better than I, is we will implement nuclear at a time and scale and pace that is affordable. And we know that, there's currently moves afoot by Eskom to get environmental impact reports in Tasman in the Eastern Cape for a possible nuclear build. But Eskom has come out and said, look, at this point, we can't afford it. But certainly on the part of Energy Minister Gwede Mantashe, he is very nuclear positive. And he is very committed, seemingly, to the prospect of South Africa, continuing on a nuclear path. Whatever that is, I don't want, this book is not a debate about which energy is the best energy. We are not having that debate. What we are having the debate about is, if you're going to do something on that scale, that procurement has to be above reproach. And the South African public need to know that it is affordable, it is safe, and it is being done in the interest of all of us, and not a small group of people who, as we've seen in many energy procurement situations, are going to benefit from kickbacks and side deals that have no benefit to the South African people.
Absolutely. Karyn Maughan, as you write, the nuclear dream may have been thwarted for now, but South Africa's nuclear ambitions are still very much alive. Very, very worrying indeed. Congratulations on a fantastic book. I cannot overstate how well researched, how well documented this book is. It is methodically researched in a way that is unbelievable in many ways, just how far Karyn and her co-author went in piecing together all the different facets of this deal, of the politics that was ensuing at the time, and what was happening in terms of government processes. Well done again, Karyn. For those who are watching, thank you very much. Please go and buy the book. The book is in bookstores today. Karyn is officially launching her book later this evening. Congratulations once again, and well done on true country duty.
Thank you so much, Qaanitah. I appreciate it.
Thank you all. We will chat again soon. And for more on Karyn's writings, you can go to www.news24.com, News24 app, and you can read Karyn Maughan's fantastic writing almost every day on News24. Thank you very much for watching.